Good afternoon. Thanks for coming. Does everybody get class credit for this? Is it mandatory? No. Okay. Well, I'm a reporter at the Providence Journal. It's a job I've held for about 25 years. In those years, I've covered everything from the banking crisis to murder trials to Steven Spielberg's visit to Hasbro Toy headquarters in Pawtucket. Well, 5 years ago, I wrote a series of stories that generated intense reader debate. Those stories focused on the state's deep role in slavery and the American slave trade. Rhode Island merchants financed more than 1,000 slave trips to Africa, I told the Journal's readers. The tiny state led the nation in slave sales and sold more than 100,000 men, women, and children to the owners of slave plantations in the West Indies, Cuba, and North America. Practically everyone was involved in this trade: farmers, merchants, barrel makers, bankers, rum makers, shipbuilders, cloth makers, insurance agents, and other manufacturers. I got a lot of emails, letters, and phone calls. Why bring this up now, readers asked. Get over it. The past is the past. It's a good question and one I hope to answer a little later. But first you need to know a little bit about me and how I stumbled onto this story. I didn't grow up with this history. In fact, I grew up in a rural, racist town in Central Florida where even in the 1960s, the Civil War was a recent memory. In elementary school, we played the gray and the blue at recess. It was a schoolyard game where two teams of mostly boys battled each other between classes. It was always tough, though, to find someone who wanted to be a Yankee. When I caught a cold or the flu, my mother took me to the local doctor who had an office on a 2-block main street. There were 2 entrances and 2 waiting rooms, one for blacks, one for whites. In high school, I learned American history from a teacher who was also a member of the NRA and the John Birch Society. Every morning she crammed 3 chalkboards with dates, places, and events, all of them about our white founding fathers. What was the date of the Battle of Yorktown, she asked. Who fired the shot heard round the world? Where did the Pilgrims land? That was my high school education, short, sharp, and slanted, but I still had more to learn about prejudice, history, and Southern culture. In the late 1970s, I got a job as a reporter for the Winter Haven News Chief, a small newspaper in Central Florida. One day my boss asked me to cover a local group, the Ku Klux Klan. Paul Rogers, the head of the Florida chapter of the United Klans of America, was a barber in Lake Wales, a small town that I covered. It was a volatile time in Florida. Blacks in 11 cities and towns had sued white city fathers for misspending federal money earmarked for poor neighborhoods on other projects. In Lake Wales, the town I covered, city officials spent money destined for low-income residents on a nice new park in an all-white neighborhood. Upset about this misuse of federal money, the government sent a team of young lawyers to take on the local officials and the good old boy attorneys. Nearly all of the towns and cities, including my hometown, Fort Meade, fought back in court. The government won every case. The Klan was not happy with the outcome. In a cow pasture 40 miles west of Disney World, men in robes burned 15-foot-high crosses near Route 27. It was my job to cover their meetings, which they held every month, just like the city council. They wore white hoods, some wore guns under their robes, and they handled large black dogs. They waved the Dixie flag, and they said terrible things about blacks, Jews, and women. If black is beautiful and tan is grand, then white is the color of the big boss man, said Robert Shelton, head of the National Klan Group. Under the night sky, I felt like I had stepped back in time. At times, I was even scared. At one meeting, a Klansman put a hand over my camera lens as I tried to photograph a young recruit. He wasn't yet wearing a hood. Another Klansman called me at home and threatened to hurt me if I wrote about a document I had found, a sheet of paper describing the Klan's organizational chart, a group of jobs and titles with weird names like Imperial Lizard and the Grand Exalted Cyclops. How does one cover a group like the Klan? I thought I'd write it straight. In story after story, I repeated the outrageous claims of the Klan leaders. I left it up to my readers to sort out the message. Most, I thought, would write them off as another angry hate group. But one day, a young woman entered the newsroom and asked if she could get a copy of a picture I had taken of a Klansman standing next to a burning cross. Why, I asked. She said it was her boyfriend's birthday, and she thought the picture would make a great gift. After nearly 30 years in Florida, I was ready to leave the South. I moved to Rhode Island in 1979. The next year, the Klan held a rally in Scotland, Connecticut, not far from the Rhode Island border. You can read a partial account of that rally in a handout that I have in front of the class. And forgive me for my long introduction to my topic, Rhode Island slavery and the slave trade, but I thought you should know a little bit about my non-New England upbringing. For the first half of my life, I believed that racism was a Southern thing. I believed that slavery was a Southern thing. I was shocked to find the Klan, Connecticut, too, operating in the shadow of New England's Ivy League colleges. The history I grew up with was pretty simple. The Southerners were the bad guys. They owned the slaves. The Northerners were the noble abolitionists and the liberators. They went to war to free the slaves. But my version of the past was deeply flawed. I discovered this through a chance meeting at my son's high school in Narragansett. The year was 2003. My son was in academic trouble again. One of his teachers stopped me in the hall and insisted I attend an upcoming lecture by a visiting professor, Joseph Apollo, a historian at James Madison University. Apollo had uncovered a very different version of America's past. He was in Rhode Island to tell students about their state's deep involvement in the slave trade. This is the story he told. In 1756, a ruthless slave ship captain named Caleb Godfrey from Newport, Rhode Island, sailed to West Africa to buy slaves for his backers, two wealthy Newport merchants. In all, Godfrey purchased more than 80 Africans, including a 10-year-old girl. He then sailed to Charleston, South Carolina, where he sold the young girl to a wealthy rice planter who lived near the Cooper River. The young girl, torn from her village in Sierra Leone, had 10 children of her own and died a slave. She was buried in an unmarked grave. Just before her death, her owner assigned her a value. 0, he wrote. But Priscilla's story did not end there. She left a 250-year paper trail, a very rare trail, one discovered by Apollo and another man, Arthur Edward Ball, whose family had owned thousands of slaves prior to the Civil War. Working independently on 2 continents, they used 18th century ship logs, letters, maps, sales receipts, and other documents to trace Priscilla back to Sierra Leone. They were able to document her exile on the Middle Passage, her harsh life in America, and the struggles of her children and her grandchildren. And ultimately, they used these documents to identify Priscilla's modern-day descendant, Tomlin Martin Polite, an African-American speech therapist working in poor black schools in Charleston, South Carolina. A few years ago, Polite, at the invitation of Sierra Leone's top officials, returned to Africa for a homecoming celebration. I was there with her, and I wrote a 3-part series about this remarkable discovery. The story won several awards, but one reader, irritated, asked, "What about the rest of Rhode Island? This is just a handful of people, but the whole state," he said, "was involved in the slave trade. Why don't you look into that?" I took him up on that offer. I spent the next 6 months digging through local, state, and federal archives, colonial records, books, and letters, and I discovered the reader was right. As I mentioned before, for about 100 years, Rhode Island's merchants financed some 1,000 trips to Africa, where they bought more than 100,000 men, women, and children. Some of this history had been buried or forgotten or even hidden. At the Redwood Library in Newport, I looked for information about Abraham Redwood, a Quaker merchant who helped build the library, one of the first in New England. The librarian pointed me to several articles, and they all described Redwood the same way, as a prosperous and enterprising merchant. None of them mentioned the key reason for his wealth. Like many Rhode Islanders, Redwood was deeply involved in slavery and the slave trade. He owned more than 200 slaves on a plantation in Antigua in the West Indies. At one point, 2 of his workers were burned at the stake for plotting against their white masters. When other Quakers decided slavery was a sin, Redwood decided he would rather be a slave trader than a Quaker, and he quit the religion. In Providence, the powerful Brown family financed more than a half-dozen slave voyages. John Brown even lost a slave ship in court after his abolitionist brother, Moses Brown, helped prosecute him. In Bristol, the DeWolfs, the most successful slave trading family in U.S. history, built mansions and started a bank, an insurance company, distilleries, and other businesses in the late 1700s. They built their mansions on the water. Captain James Wolfe, who was charged with murdering a slave, won a seat in Congress. Nearly half of the Rhode Island slave trade occurred after the state and the federal government outlawed it. One author, J. Coftree, put it this way in his landmark book, The Notorious Triangle. Rhode Island was the most important carrier of African slaves from 1725 to 1807. What has been called the American slave trade might be better termed the Rhode Island slave trade. In telling this story for journal readers, I tried to break new ground. The paper had written a few stories about this topic, broad, generic summaries peppered with comments from experts. Pretty dry stuff. But I wanted to cover the story like a beat reporter, like someone covering City Hall or the State House. I remembered what Gay Talese, a reporter at the New York Times, said about covering people who weren't politicians, celebrities, or newsmakers. He said, I wanted to write about people as people. Even when I was a daily journalist, I was stuck with hard news, and I wanted to write the hard news through people and their stories. No one had really explained how the Rhode Island slave trade worked on a daily basis. What did it look like? Who were the key players? Who did they socialize with? And where did they go to church? They all went to church. And finally, what was it like for the slaves? In telling this story, I used plenty of primary and secondary sources to bring this world to life. I read faded letters and old ledgers. Some places I had to don white cotton gloves to read them. And I pored over crucial books like the Diary of Ezra Stiles, who kept a meticulous account of Newport's religious, social, and business life during the 1700s. These, along with early newspaper accounts, helped me recreate the slave trade in the major ports. I was able to write with accuracy about the night when Ezra Stiles visited a dying slave ship captain. I knew from an early newspaper how cold it was. Writing in his diary, Stiles said that the winter had been so harsh that his window had frozen shut. And I knew what Stiles thought as he watched the slave trader, a member of his church, die. He had spent all of his life as a slave ship captain, Stiles wrote in his diary after closing the dead man's eyes. But I have reason to think that if he had his life to live over again, he would not choose to spend it buying and selling the human species. Writing about South County's role in the slave trade was a little harder. Although I worked with some primary documents, I also relied heavily on three relatively recent studies to help me piece together the region's history. A book by Brown graduate Joanne Pope Mellish, a harder-to-find book by Robert Fitz called Inventing the New England Slave Trade Paradise, and finally Christian McBurney's unpublished Brown University thesis. And here's what I discovered in an area that's not far from here. By 1708, 426 Africans lived among 6,755 whites in Rhode Island, about 6% of the population. A half century later, Africans and African Americans, most of them enslaved, made up 11.5% of the state's population. About a third of those lived in this area, called the Narragansett Country, many of them on large plantations in North and South Kingstown, Charleston, and Westerly. A number of these plantation owners, men like Roland Robinson, Hezekiah Babcock, and Nathaniel Gardner, sold beef, cheese, and sheep to Aaron Lopez, Newport's wealthiest merchants, both a slave trader and a slave owner. Lopez shipped these South County products, produced in part by slave labor, to slave plantations in the West Indies. Later, writers romanticized slave trade, or slave life on these country farms and plantations. In his 1920 History of Rhode Island, Thomas Bicknell described the relationship this way. The Narragansett Country was the slave paradise of the northern colonies. Every farm had its quota, and the family life of the slaves was recognized and protected. Labor indoors or out was not excessive. The relation of the master to slave was kind and humane, and punishments were usually mild and corrective. The well-to-do land class had no occasion to use the lash. Indulgence rather than severity characterized the Narragansett masters. The documents from the era tell another story. The Reverend James McSparran, head of the region's Anglican church, wrote about his slaves in a diary. He lived not far from URI's main campus. Here's what he said about his slave Hannibal. Thursday, August the 29th, 1751. I got up this morning early, and finding Hannibal had been out, I stripped and gave him a few lashes till he begged. Hannibal's crime? He was headstrong and disobedient, said McSparran. To control slaves in the slave trade, the Rhode Island General Assembly enacted more than 35 laws during a 200-year period, some of them restricting slave movement and behavior. In South Kingstown, the town fathers passed laws that forbid slaves from owning livestock. The colony also made it a crime for freed blacks or whites to entertain slaves. The punishment for both the slave and his host was a whipping. The slave paradise, the record suggests otherwise. After 6 months of research, I wrote a 7-part series for the journal called The Unrighteous Traffic, Rhode Island and the Slave Trade. Reader response to the series was mostly positive. Many said they were unfamiliar with the state's slave trade history and wondered why it wasn't taught in their schools. Some things have changed since then. Rhode Island's role in the slave trade is no longer a secret. And some Rhode Island teachers now devote several weeks to the topic in their American history classes. The State Department of Education doesn't require them to do so. So back to the question that started this talk. Why drag this up now? Yes, Rhode Islanders were slave traders and slave owners, but that was a long time ago, said the readers. Like any good reporter, I had a few reasons for digging up the past. When I wrote the series in March 2006, Rhode Island and the slave trade was in the news. A few years earlier, Brown University had formed a committee to examine the school's own ties to slavery and the slave trade. The committee was finishing its report when my series appeared. That was my local news hook, but there was more than that. In Newport, anthropologist James Garman at Salve Regina University was digging up new evidence of the slave trade along Newport's tourist-heavy waterfront. And in Boston, documentary filmmaker Katrina Brown was finishing a film about her ancestor, the Rhode Island captain James DeWolf, the most successful slave trader in U.S. history. The topic, as news editors often say, had legs. And when Brown University released its report, the story went national, appearing in the New Yorker and on the Today Show. But why continue, as I have done, to report on this story? My answer is simple, because our full history hasn't been told yet. Rhode Island's early economy was built in large part on slavery and the slave trade. Rhode Island ship captains made their backers wealthy by buying and selling African men, women, and children. Rhode Island farmers and merchants made money selling goods to slave plantation owners in the West Indies. And often untold, African slaves helped build Brown's University Hall and Newport's first courthouse. They worked as carpenters and stonemasons and chocolate grinders and pastry chefs. In 1780, Newport Gardner, a former slave, established the African Union Society, the state's first black benevolent association, and a model for similar associations started around the nation later. At Brown University and Yale University, two scholars are working on a new version of American history, one that places Southern slavery in Northern manufacturing. The Northerners made hose and blankets and shoes and uniforms for the Southern slaves, at the center of the nation's economic growth, not on the periphery. Says Seth Rockman, a professor at Brown University, few people intuitively connect the story of the Industrial Revolution to the labor of enslaved Africans on cotton plantations. It takes about 1 second to remember that cotton didn't grow in Lowell, Massachusetts, but involves a huge conceptual leap to see that Massachusetts and Mississippi are part of the same economy, rather than as separate universes. So this is news, I think. It's bound to make some Rhode Islanders and New Englanders uncomfortable. Yes, Abraham Redwood built a great library in Newport. But he also condoned burning slaves at the stake. When I was writing the series, some people squirmed and a few people would not talk to me and my photographer. The head of one historic home even chased us away. I sometimes think of a speech Brown University President Ruth Simmons made a few years ago when she decided to investigate Brown's ties to slavery and the slave trade. Simmons, a descendant of slaves, had discovered that the university's oldest building had been built by slaves, and she wanted to know more, even though some of her friends warned her not to push too far. What would the university's donors say? She said, "History still exerts a powerful influence on us. Brown's probe into its slave past will be painful," she said, but she added, "I welcome any discomfort this process causes as necessary. Stare on the edge that we learn." Thank you. And if you have any questions about the series I wrote, the newspapers are here. There's also a handout that includes sources in case you're interested in this history. Any questions about slavery? Slavery in Rhode Island. The Providence Journal, yes?
Well, Rhode Island's a big, well, it's the ocean state, so there's a lot of trading anyway. Would you say that that would probably be why slavery was really big in Rhode Island? You know what I'm saying?
No, I think...
Well, like, Newport was always very active in, like, trading anyway, so
yeah.
I think that also...
I think part of the reason was that, unlike some states, Rhode Island really didn't have a product to ship.
Okay.
So they actually took they sold slaves, or they bought slaves in Africa, took them to the West Indies, traded them for rum, took the rum back, or traded them for molasses, took the molasses back to Rhode Island, made rum out of it, and then used the rum to buy more slaves.
Okay.
That's the infamous triangle.
Okay.
Yes?
So how did this, as you went through this process of research and reporting, how did this change you? How did this affect you on a personal level?
I think it really opened my eyes. I mean, as I said, I grew up in a pretty racist area, and I bought into that myth that the Southerners were the bad guys and the Northerners were the heroes in this story. And when I discovered that was not true, I brought that to the attention of my editors, and they were just as astounded. And I'm thinking, well, I grew up in Florida. I have a reason for not knowing this history, but you're Rhode Islanders. Shouldn't you know this? Why is this news to you? So I think what it did was it made me understand that we tell a flawed version of U.S. history, and that African Americans are a huge part of this history. They're not, when you look at textbooks, you have all these topics, and then suddenly you get slavery, and then there's 2 pages devoted to slavery. I think these scholars at Yale and Brown are right. This story is central to the American story. It's not a sideshow or a sidebar. So I think that's how it changed me, and it sort of made me a missionary in making sure that this story is told, the full story is told. Yes?
Was the triangle trade only in the north, or was it also in the south? I'm just trying
Well, the Northerners made the rum. There were
right.
20 distilleries in Newport at one time, or in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut. They had distilleries, so they were making money off this rum business.
But in the southern states, they didn't have that kind of trade.
The southern states wanted the slaves to work in the rice plantations, cotton plantations, tobacco. So they weren't involved in the actual, I mean, some of them sent a few ships out, but really it was Rhode Island that was the major player in going to Africa and buying slaves and selling them back in the North America and the West Indies.
So we had more slaves up here in the north than they had in the south?
We had the greatest concentration in New England. There were actually more slaves per person in New York, but Rhode Island had the largest concentration of slaves in New England. There were many, many more African Americans and Africans in the South. In Charleston, or in South Carolina at one point, more than half the state was black. And in fact, they often fled their plantations in the heat and came to Newport, Rhode Island in the summers.
Did Rhode Island export slaves to other states as well?
I don't think so. I think they brought a small amount back to work in households and on farms, but I don't think they then exported them. And eventually many of them bought their own freedom or won their own freedom and started businesses and became stonemasons.
So the ships would stop the Rhode Island ships would stop in South Carolina and Charleston?
Charleston was the major entry
Yeah.
port for all Africans in North America.
Okay.
In fact, one historian has called it the Ellis Island for Africans.
I have friends that bought a house in Bristol, Rhode
Yep.
Island. This was going back about 20 years, and they actually found an underground tunnel that went from the harbor in Bristol to the house.
Yeah.
Where they used to, I guess after they outlawed slavery, they still
Yeah.
brought the slaves in underground.
Although the DeWolfs just flouted the law, they didn't
Yeah.
really care. They had a relative who was the customs agent, who was supposed to be in charge of making sure slave ships didn't come and go. And in fact, at one point, they kidnapped somebody, one of the lawmakers, while the ship came in, so he wouldn't observe it. So, and DeWolf himself threw a slave overboard. He later said, well, she had a disease and I didn't want her to infect the rest of them, but he tied her to a chair and threw her overboard and supposedly said, well, there goes the loss of one good chair. And he was elected to Congress. James DeWolf also bought 2 slaves for his wife as a Christmas present, 2 small children.
Yeah, Linden Place too. in Bristol.
Linden Place was one of the places that did not want us around because they rent out their grounds for weddings and things, and you don't really want to be known as a center for the slave trade. It's not very romantic to be married there.
Do you think with this history, is this maybe one of the reasons why Rhode Island doesn't seem to appreciate the beautiful state that we have here? It seems like Rhode Islanders are always kind of, I'm not a native Rhode Islander, but
Yeah.
I've been here for 20 years. And it seems like they're always kind of down on their state. And I'm wondering if it is linked back to that history that they don't recognize or don't appreciate. But
I don't know.
yeah, I don't know.
I don't know the answer to that one. No, I'm not a Rhode Islander either. I don't understand the attitude Rhode Islanders sometimes have about their own state. I mean, it's a pretty harsh history, but also, there are a lot of things that Rhode Islanders did that were pretty terrific. Roger Williams and his views on religious liberty.
Were we active, was the state active in the Underground Railroad? And you mentioned Moses Brown being the abolitionist.
I don't think so. I think by the time they got here, they were fine. And in Rhode Island, they did treat the Africans differently because they lived with them, unlike the South where they lived, segregated in a large camp away from the big house. In Rhode Island, they were pretty much a part of the fabric, and they went to church. And
So you told the story.
Yep.
How do you plan on continuing to tell the story, getting it out to where it will be told?
Whenever someone breaks a news item, if Jim Garman digs up something else in Newport, I write about it. This convention they just had at Brown, where they're convinced that the story of the American economy is the one where the North and South are in collusion, but they're not apart in separate worlds. But in fact, the North is manufacturing all these items for the Southern slave owners. I mean, they need one another. So those two things. I know Brown University is at work on a slave memorial. They've been at it for 5 years and have yet to erect it, but I know at some point they're going to do that. They've promised to do some other things. Whenever this story surfaces in one way or another, I try to write about it. I have to compete with mob stories and other things.
And pensions.
Yes, and the pension story.
When we built the Ryan Center
Yep.
here, we had to move the footprint, the original footprint, because there was a cemetery there, which contained slaves from the original owner of this land, and some Narragansetts. So we right here at URI.
You probably had Lloyd Wilcox there, the medicine man for the Narragansett
we also
Indians.
had Bellish.
Yep, Joanna
From Brown.
Mills. Yep.
Yes. No, actually, it was a woman from Narragansett. Historian, I can't think of her.
Probably Ella Secatow.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, it was. Yeah. It's on the the south lobby as you walk in, that land. is-
So I'm just curious, back when I wrote the series, a number of high schools asked me to talk to the students, and students inevitably would say, well, how come we aren't taught this? And then I would have to look at the teacher and go. So maybe you want to answer that. But do you feel like this story is well known now, or is it still a surprise? Is it taught?
Good question.
Is it taught here at URI?
Was it taught in high school? Was it taught in grammar school?
This is the first I've heard of it.
That's what I. Anyone else?
Really focused on the South. Like,
Say it louder.
Really focused on like the South, like more known for slavery
Mhm.
instead of the North.
I'm a native Rhode Islander, or at least I moved here when I was 4, and I went to elementary, middle school, high school in Providence, just never heard of it.
There has been a movement by some scholars to, insist that the state teach this as part of the curriculum whenever they teach any kind of American history course. And I know some teachers, I know some in Narragansett, my son's former high school, are teaching it now, but it's not widespread and it's not required. Yes?
I was just wondering with the students, we teach a course, it's History 150 or AAF 150 that deals with this. And I was wondering, is anybody taking it? And do they deal with this subject in that course? It's African American history. Nobody's taken that class?
So can I ask another question? Because I
Sure.
heard your question. I wanted to ask that one. So having heard this now, what impact, how does it impact you? Or what does it make you think or want to do? Or
Just kind of eye-opening. Just, surprising that, our little state was more involved than we were originally let on to believe. Certainly interesting.
How many people here are from Rhode Island?
Yep.
Well, I live like about 10 minutes away, and the development I live in is to be on a farm. So I guess that was like a farm once.
Yep. Yeah, there were huge farms, and they called them plantations here in the South County area. And they had as many as 20 Africans working, making cheese, tending the animals, hoeing corn, and they were famous in this area for making cheese, and the Africans were involved in that as well. But some people have said there were as many as 200 slaves, but scholars have been unable to verify that by looking at the probate records. The average plantation had about 20 slaves.
and so the name of our state, Rhode Island and the Providence plantations, that's where it comes from.
Well, there's all kinds of disagreement on that.
Okay, well, that's how I see it.
Yes.
That's how I view it.
And that's how some people see it, and that's why there was a movement to take that out of the state's name.
So sad that it didn't.
Other people have said that it really goes back to planting the seed of a colony. That's the meaning of a plantation. But there are a number of states, I think about a half dozen now, lawmakers in at least 6 states have apologized for the slave trade, most of them in the South, but I think at least one in the North, and there was some movement at one point in Rhode Island to get the lawmakers to do the same, to acknowledge this past. But none of those things have happened.
It's very difficult, don't you think? Because
I do.
it's painful and it's, I think as a country, we tend to look at other countries
Yep.
and easily pick out their faults. And one time I interviewed a professor here who noted that we had a Holocaust museum right in Washington, D.C. that, was huge and beautiful, and it talked about, the Holocaust in Germany. And so she said, it surprised her, because it didn't happen here, that we had a museum in the country's capital where slavery happened here, and there isn't a museum like that at all.
Yeah.
So, it's hard to look at that mirror, I guess.
But you can also look at, I mean, it is a harsh past, but you can also celebrate the achievements of the people who were involved. You know, the slaves, I mean, clearly the slaves helped build America. I mean, I don't understand why that should be painful to teach. and you know, lots of people talk about the legacy of slavery, and I know some people are fearful of the reparations movement, and I think that's part of what spurred Brown University to start digging into their own past. I think they wanted to be ahead of that reparations threat.
But I think part of the healing, I mean, you can never truly heal until you look at the ugly, you know, just start cleaning the wound, just going back.
Yeah.
And I love how you said just celebrating what was accomplished, and the fact that slavery did end,
Yeah.
and we can go forward, and people are doing great things, and we just have to continue on. But you have to look at that.
Yeah. So here's a picture of James DeWolf's grave. And here's, actually this mural is right across the street at the Pettiquanska Historical Society. It's one of the few paintings that actually shows a young African boy in the White household. There aren't, when I wrote this series, there are very few things that I could rely on to illustrate the story, because this history isn't illustrated. And there are some other things, like the in fact, the largest African American burial ground is in Newport, Rhode Island. If you cross the bridge, it's almost immediately there on the left. It's a pretty interesting cemetery. And some of the headstones, the figures do, as a historian there likes to point out, they do not resemble George and Martha Washington. They resemble blacks, and they have black features and black faces. So it's a pretty interesting cemetery to visit. Well, anything else? I know you guys want to get outside today. It's beautiful.
Well,
Thank you. Really. Yeah.
I like what you, I mean, just the thing that you said, that African Americans did build this country. That makes me proud.
Yeah.
We did, and it should be noted.
It should be part of every history book, every history lesson. And as I said, too often it's that sidebar.
Right.
You know, you have all the great movements in American history, and oh yeah, and there was slavery. But it's really, I mean, the first slave ship in Rhode Island was in the late 1600s. It starts with the beginning of the country. Okay. All right. Thank you.